In this video, I want to solve a problem I found online. It's been summarized by Matt Ellington. He originally found it on the Mr. Excel forum by this guy, Legal Hustler, where he describes the problem in detail. And basically, I've copied this dataset. The dataset represents machines that have a unique ID, and the machines can break, and every day they're broken, we have a date. And if there are consecutive dates, which we have here, the 19th, 20th, and 21st, that means the machine broke on the 19th, it was broken the next day, and then on the 21st, it was fixed. Our solution is what's presented down here. I need to know for each time the machine broke, what was the first day it broke, and what was the day it was finally fixed. We have some assumptions. I can assume that here we have the 17th and the 19th. I can assume that anytime the machine is fixed, it won't break the next day. Otherwise, I could have a situation where the machine is fixed on the 20th and then broken again on the 21st. We're going to pretend that doesn't happen. An issue we'll need to deal with is that a machine can break on Friday. I think that's a Friday. And then it's still broken on Monday. That still counts as being consecutive. I'm not going to deal with vacations. You'd need to check if the day between is a vacation day. And then you'd also need to check if there are multiple vacation days. But we're going to pretend that doesn't happen. And Matt Ellington has made a video where he solves the problem. I haven't watched that because I wanted to come up with my own solution. I made 3 solutions to this problem, and I'll go through the first 2 in this video. The first solution uses a group, but I use GroupLocal, which you'll see what that means. And then the second solution uses a FillDown to figure out the correct dates. I've copied in the dataset here, and we can initially see a bit of a problem because this is actually a date, and this is an empty string, but a date can't be an empty string. Simply changing the type fixes the problem. Now we have dates and we have nulls instead. When we unpivot this, it can be a problem to have a null, because unpivoting will delete null rows. In this situation, we actually want it. Right now, the issue is that values are stored in columns rather than rows, which means we have 1 row for each machine. But that also means in the future, when this machine breaks, I'll have another column, so I need to deal with that. Well, let's start out by referencing the data query inside of the first solution. And I'll start out by unpivoting other columns, which is easily done by right-clicking the column and then saying unpivot others. And this function only needs to reference the column that you're using as sort of the base, the key, or whatever you want to call it. And this means I don't have to reference the column names, which solves the issue with whenever the machines break again, we'll get new columns. And also I get rid of the nulls, which in this case, it's actually a good thing. We don't actually need this attribute column. That's simply the name of the column. We only need the date, and we can change this to be called failed date. And actually, I'll make that capitalized, and then I can delete this attribute field. I'm going to solve this problem using a grouping. Since this solution relies on GroupKind.Local, I need to sort my columns first on ID and then on the failed date. And this will make sense in a moment. We'll do ID first and then date, and it has to be ascending. You don't have to do ascending on ID, but I'm going to do that. I then want to add an index, which will start from 1, which is also very easy to do with the UI. I need to figure out whether the date is a Friday or a Monday, because here I have the 21st and the 24th. I need to know if this is a Friday and this is the following Monday. So we're going to select the failed date column, and under the add column tabs, we can say date. I want the day of week. I could use the day.Monday enumeration instead of 1, because the day.Monday function returns 1, but this means we have it in text and that's easier to understand. The day of week function will make the first day of the week, in this case a Monday, be 0, and I don't like that, so I'm going to add 1 to it. And this is just my personal preference. Now we know that 1 is Monday and 7 is Sunday. Yeah, we don't have any Saturday or Sundays because no one is working on those days in our factory, which means here we can confirm my suspicion from earlier that here we have the 21st, which is a Friday, and then the 24th is a Monday, which means these are actually consecutive, even though the days aren't consecutive. And that's something we'll need to deal with. But we already have everything we need to know. I want to add a new column where I check whether the next day is consecutive or not. This is going to be a bit messy, and I could make a function, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to press the custom column button because I want more room to write in than I do in that little box. We'll be writing it manually. Add column to the previous step, which is called same ID plus next day, where my function then is The way I've chosen to solve this problem is I'm going to look at the current row and then check the previous row if those are related, which means that the first row can't be related to the previous row because there is no previous row. You could also do it the other way around. Then you'd need to check the last row and say that, well, since I checked the current date and the date of the next row and there is no next row because I'm in the last row, then you need to do something. But I'm doing it this way because I know the first row of my table is always row 1. Whereas I don't know what the last row of my table is. I need to go in and check the count of rows inside of my table and then reference the last row. So this is just a bit easier, meaning I can simply say if my index column is equal to 1, then output a no, because this can't be a consecutive day to the previous row, because again, that doesn't exist. Then I can say else if, and then I want to define a variable because that makes it a bit easier. And since I'm in this part of the code, I have access to the underscore because I'm iterating through my table. That means when I define a variable, it's within the context of the current row, which means that will be recalculated for each row. I want to say let previous row equal, then I need to access the table in the previous step and do my lookup, which is then I want to access the row, and the row that I want to access is then go into the current row's index column and say -2. When I do this lookup, it's actually a list lookup, and lists start at index 0, which means when I'm in this second row, my index is 2, and if I need to access the previous row, then that's 2 minus 2, because the first row is then actually index 0. Then I can say in, and we can actually add a comment here, and because I want to write something to the right of my comment, I need to use the /* syntax. I can say check previous row, and I want to extract the entire row because I need to compare the ID columns and the fail date columns. I can say in, I want to say if the ID column of the current row, that's why I don't have to write anything before. I could write the underscore, or I could change the each to something like current row, but this takes less space. So if this is equal to the previous row, this ID column, and we actually need a lot of conditions because I both need to check if the days are following one another. I need to check if the current row is a Monday and the previous row is a Friday and they're consecutive. So we need a couple of parentheses. I want to check if the day of week of the current row is equal to 1, so a Monday, and then I want to check if the date of the current row minus the date of the previous row, if that's equal to 3, then I know that this is a Friday and that's the consecutive Monday. I still need to check if the day of week of the current row is Monday, because otherwise you'd end up with saying that Monday and Thursday are related, which they aren't. So we need that check as well. Do a lookup into the previous row. It says failed date column. Actually, I needed to write something here. Number.from, because this is dates and I want to get not a date, but a number. I want to say failed date and then minus the lookup. And then we need a parenthesis if that is equal to 3. So that's fine. And then we also need a closing parenthesis here after the 3, because it could also be or. So I'm trying to add indentation to make it seem that these two are related, because we need the ID to equal the previous ID and one of these two conditions to be true. So it either needs to be a Monday and the previous row is the previous Friday, or the current row is a Tuesday and the previous row is the previous Monday. We can repeat this, and actually I could copy that, or this needs to be true, but instead it needs to be a 1. The current row is Tuesday and the previous row is the previous Monday. Actually, that is it. Then I can say that if this is true, then I want to output same ID plus next day. And actually, it needs to be spelled the same as the header. And otherwise, I want to output a no. And then that gives an error because it's not called day of week. It's called day of week with a capital W. So I need to find that. And then it still says it's errors and it's confused here. But if we click a previous step and go back, it fixes itself. And this is what I expect. And this is actually already the crux of our calculation. The only thing I want to add is to make this type text, so we don't have to do that later. And now we can do the actual grouping, because I now know that if the value in this column is no, then this needs to be its own group. But if the value in the next row is same ID plus next day, then they're related. In this case, we have the 19th, 20th, 21st, and 24th. Those are all related, and that's why we can use the group.local, because we only have 2 values. I could also have called these false and true, and that would make it a bit easier maybe, but I think this text is more helpful. So we're going to start out by using a normal grouping. Normally we'd want to do a grouping on ID, but in our case I actually need to do the same ID because again I only have 2 situations and I've already accounted for the ID. That was why I needed to do this check. And then I also want the index column to do my grouping, and that will make sense in a bit. I want to do a grouping, and then we'll change it to be a GroupKind.Local. For now, I want to grab all of my rows, and we can call that all, and then we get that. And then this is not exactly what we want, because we actually want the entire column here to say no. Because if we go in and check, this isn't what we want. Yeah. Because it actually hasn't grouped. Because when you do a normal grouping, it simply looks at the unique combinations between these two columns and say, well, I want all of the values that are duplicates to be in one group. We can see we have 12 rows and we also have 12 rows now. And all of these tables give us one row, but we can fix that. And here inside of the all, it's going to give me this table, which I actually don't need, but we're going to keep it. You could also delete all of this if you wanted to, if you don't care about the types, but I'm just going to keep it. We're going to make a line break to make it a bit easier to follow. And then I need to mind my parentheses and say I actually only need to move the normal parentheses. I want to change this to be GroupKind.Local. And actually, before I go further, let's just look at what it says, because I think it's just an enumeration. We can do table group and then see what it says here. It says GroupKind, optional, GroupKind.Local or global. If you have a normal table where you want to do a grouping, you can also use GroupKind.Local. This requires that the data set is sorted based on the column you want to group. Maybe you want to group based on date. And actually, there are no examples here. We only have this one example. We also need to specify a comparer, but we'll get to that. I learned about GroupKind.Local and making your own comparison function from BI Gorilla or Rig the Group. We can see on this page here, using custom comparers, we can find some examples down here. Here uses GroupKind.Global, and the function will provide us two values, which I believe is the current row and the previous row, and that's where you do your comparison. Where here he says X name and Y name, and then GroupKind.Global will do a comparison where you can have -1, 0 or +1, and I believe -1 means the left value is lower and +1 means the left value is greater, and if the two values are equal, then you get a 0, which means it needs to be grouped together. When you use global, you need to have -1 and +1 because the data needs to be sorted, so the lowest value goes first and the highest value goes last. And that's some database stuff that I don't understand, but basically you need to know which rows need to be grouped together. And if you can figure out which values are smallest, then you can sort the table and that makes it faster. But we're using GroupKind.Local, which we can see if we scroll down. He uses this as an example where he does a check here if the value is a number, where here he wants to check if the value is a number. And in this case, he has a column with year or null. So if the value is a year, then he wants to group the values here together. So he wants Alice, Bob, and Carol to be combined in one group. That's why he does this. And we can see we get that. We're going to use the same logic. To summarize the tangent, since I'm using GroupKind.Local, I need to have a function that will output 0 or 1. So we're going to add another comma and then a line break and then say I get the current row and the next row. So actually I was wrong. My notes are correct. You have access to the current row and the next row, and then you're comparing the two, and you have access to the entire row, not just one column. So we do a grouping on index and same ID plus next day. So we're doing a grouping based on these two columns, which means we have access to those two values inside of our function. So we're going to say if my next row, and then I need to grab the value in same ID next day. So I will copy this. And even though I use the square bracket syntax, I need to use the hashtag quotation mark to access my column. I can say if this value is equal to no, and then I added in my notes that the first row is always no, then I want to output 1. Otherwise, I want to output 0. And then we can see everything gets grouped. And like in the example here, if the value of your function outputs a 1, then that means it's a new group. And if the function outputs a 0, then it needs to be grouped together with the previous rows. That's why in Rig the Group's example, he ends up with nulls to be grouped together with the 2001 row, because his function is if the location ID is a number, then output 1. He uses number.from to convert the true into a 1 and the false into 0. Now we have our grouping, but we still need to access the failed date to get the first row, which is the day the machine broke, and the last row, which is the day the machine was fixed. But we have everything stored in this table, and that makes it very easy. Now we can add a custom column. I want to extract the first failed date, which is convenient because that's always the first row. We have a function called table.first, which can get what I want. My table is found within the all column, and I only want to extract one value. Let's just send this, and we get a record. And then I can say I only want to access the value in the failed date column. Alternatively, I could also use the curly brackets to say go into the all column, use curly brackets, 0 curly brackets to get the first value, and then get the fail date. But I think this makes more sense when you read it. And then I want to add that this is type date. We can get the fixed date by doing almost the same thing, because just as there's a table first function, there's also a table last, which again is very convenient. And again, I want to access the failed date, and it doesn't give me IntelliSense because Power Query thinks I want to access the first failed date, which is a column in my normal table and not my nested table. That's why I clicked in the all column so I can see the name. And then we can say, okay, actually I want to change the name to say last failed date, aka fixed date. Again, I want to output type date. Lastly, I want to access the ID that's currently stored inside of my nested table. Once more, I want to get the first. It doesn't matter if you use table first or table last. And that should be a number. Actually, I want that to be type text, because it's not a number, it's a unique identifier. And I can see, because the value is on the right and in curly, I need to convert this into a text. I'll say text.from and grab that. And that's because the ID is not actually a number. You do math with numbers, but this is a unique identifier, which is text. And that also means we could do text manipulation, like adding a prefix or suffix. Since I got this problem and the solution from this page, Accelerator BI, I want to end up with the same sort order as he does. He has it sorted not ascending, but 1, 2, 3, 9, 9, 9, 8, 8, 8, 7, 7, 7. I want to add that sort so we get the same as he does. And I'm just going to cheat and copy this in from my notes. And yes, I know I should name my steps properly, but I'm too lazy to do that. And that's actually wrong. And that's because this is a number. So I need to wrap that. And conveniently, when you highlight text, you can use the quotation marks and you don't overwrite the text. Instead, you wrap it. You can also do this with parentheses. So that's a neat little trick. And then we can sort it based on this in ascending order. We also need to sort on the first failed date, and then that should be everything. And then the only columns we need are the ID, first failed date and last failed date. And the reason I select them in this order is when I remove the other column, it also sorts my columns, which we can see in the sort order up here, which means I should now have the same output as Matt Ellington does, which should be the case if my eyes don't deceive me. Yep. So that was the first solution. I'm going to make the two first solutions in the same video because they're identical until we get to the grouping. So we will delete these. Everything is the same as before. We get the fail date. We do a lookup to determine whether the previous row is related to the current row. And then we're going to use FillDown to figure out what the first fail date is. And then we work from here. That is the first thing we're going to do. We're going to add a column where we simply check if the value inside of the same ID next day column is equal to no. Then I want to extract the fail date because that's then the first fail date. Otherwise I want nulls. And it's important that I get nulls, not an actual value, because then we can use FillDown. And I could also change this function to output null instead of same ID plus next day. I'm choosing to keep this because it makes it more obvious for the reader. We will call this first fail date. The only thing I want to change is that this should be type date. And then all we have to do is to right click the column and say FillDown. Now we replace nulls with the first fail date. I then want to sort this descending in order to get the last failed date. Then we can remove duplicates from my first failed date column and the ID column. By doing it this way, we will keep the first row, which then has the first failed date and the current failed date. We can then sort descending on the failed date column because we now have the first failed date and we have the rows' failed date, which means we have duplicates in the first failed date column, but because we sorted descending on the failed date column, that means if we now select the first failed date and the ID column and remove duplicates, that means we're going to keep the first row with our current sort, which is then actually the last day that the machine broke in this series of having broken days. I hope that makes sense. And actually I want to use table.buffer because I have a bad history of removing duplicates from a table, but it actually doesn't respect the sort order that I had previously. And then we end up with some very weird results. All I have to do is wrap this in table.buffer. And that does take some computational power, but it actually guarantees results, so I'm happy with it. And we can see that actually the value is updated, so it was a very good idea to do that. And it's very easy to forget this. But now I have to update the column headers because it's no longer the failed date, it's actually the correction date or the fixed date. And the first failed date is then actually the failed date. And you could also have named the column this when you created it here. In my case, I called it failed date with a capital D, so that would have been fine. But we're going to do it together because I think that makes more sense for the reader. Now all I have to do is what I did in the first solution, which is to restore the original sort order, the one we see on the web page. I can copy the previous step and insert that, and then we have the same sort order.